Tonight. It's going to be a good talk on a good subject. I'm Michael Boucher, the director of the Journalism School, and it's an honor to welcome to Iowa State Mercedes Lendi Uriarte. In tonight's talk, Diversity and Its Discontents, is co-sponsored by the Greenlee School of Journalism Communication and the Committee on Lectures. I want to thank Mark Witherspoon for helping to coordinate Dr. Uriarte's visit. Tonight we welcome this amazing journalist and scholar. She comes to us from the University of Texas at Austin, where she is an associate professor of journalism, Latin American studies, and women's studies. She's earned a bachelor's, master's, and PhD at Yale as a single mother, an accomplishment that shows character and commitment, and those are the two attributes that people often use to describe her. Before entering academia in September 1986, Dr. D. Uriarte was an editor and writer for the Los Angeles Times. One of her professional contributions including leading an investigative team into Uruguay on behalf of the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization directed now by Greenlee School alumna Ann Cooper. Dr. D. Uriarte reported on conditions faced by journalists as Uruguay moved from dictatorship into democracy, and her reputation as both journalist and scholar is inspiring, as you'll hear tonight. Upon learning that she was willing to visit us, we at the Greenlee School quickly took advantage of that opportunity. We want to prepare future journalists for the diverse world that awaits them, even here in Iowa. At present, Iowa's Latino population is growing rapidly, the fastest growing segment of the state population. State and national media based in Iowa must learn quickly how to be more inclusive, both in coverage and hiring practices. And I guess a good example of this might be Meredith Corporation, which now has a Hispanic Ventures division featuring Spanish language publications. For several decades now, the news media have been struggling with diversity. Companies have focused a large part of their efforts on recruiting people of color into the newsroom. That is needed, of course, but why then are we still dealing with a lack of diversity? Not only in newsroom, but in coverage. Our speaker tonight has an answer for that. She did a study funded by the Ford Foundation entitled Diversity Disconnects from Classroom to Newsroom, which found that the news media have failed in diversity efforts largely because it put its resources and efforts into integration, getting more people of color into the newsroom, and then putting the burden on them to diversify coverage. That formula hasn't worked very well, as her study shows. I was particularly interested in her research because I am an advocate of community journalism, and as such, I believe that media should cover geographic area, all segments of society, simply by studying the map. I criticize coverage that targets so-called affluent consumers or other groups identified by lifestyle and buying habits. My argument has been that if we cover geographic community, we also ensure a large measure of diversity, not only ethnic, but also age bracket and socioeconomic class as well. After all, the operative word of circulation is circle, which you draw on a map in a newsroom. But once you start targeting clusters in those circles, identifying people who share consumer habits, for instance, the purpose of coverage is linked to revenue projections, not information. Whole areas of the population can be passed over as if they did not exist. Dr. D. Uriarte's work has inspired me to promote both integration and strategic planning in the newsroom and classroom, and if we do that, we can ensure greater levels of inclusivity. In this respect, she is a pioneer. So says Federico Sobervi, director of the Latinos in Media Project in Austin. I spoke with him tonight. And he's associated with the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, as was our speaker for quite some time as the chair of the Commission on the Status of Minorities. But in speaking with Dr. Sobervi tonight from the Latinos in Media Project, I learned more about the depth of her commitment to inclusivity. He says that she's ahead of her time. She's always, he says, ahead of her time. I'm going to quote him now. Because of her efforts, diversity is being recognized more. She was one of the few who played a central role to approach diversity systematically in the newsroom. Part of the reason for her success, he believes, is that she is both a professional and a scholar. Her colleague at Texas, Don Hyder, a graduate advisor there, and a person I know, agrees with that assessment. And it's always good to quote a colleague in introduction when one is far from home. Dr. Hyder says that our speaker tonight is passionate about what journalism could and should do. Professional and academic experience often is the recipe, he says, for some of the best and toughest critics who have worked in newsrooms and care deeply about the practice of journalism. Dr. Hyder says she has been a significant figure in the fight for civil rights in the academy. I'm going to quote him. She is holding journalism education's feet to fire to do a better job of recruiting students, faculty, and administrators. She challenges us to think about the very way we practice and teach journalism on a day-to-day basis so that we are more inclusive in an age when the demographics in the United States are changing so significantly. Iowa and Iowa State are changing significantly too. It is our hope tonight in hearing your message that you might prepare us for that change. Please help me welcome Dr. Mercedes Lynn de Uriarte.
Well, you know, you're always supposed to come to these things and you're all just cool, right? But that was a really moving introduction, and particularly since I complain a lot about the way we teach and the way we report. So it's nice to hear some nice things from my colleagues. Thank you. We are changing as a nation. By the time students who are studying journalism today are at the peak of their careers, in that spot where hopefully you can be the decision maker, this nation will be neither minority nor majority. Already California and Texas are minority-majority states. The rest of this nation will look that way. By 2050, they estimate. However, each year they move that figure closer. The last time I looked, it was 2040, and some people are saying 2035. It's a very different nation coming. And even when we live in a white enclave, within that kind of textural change, we won't be able to escape it very long if we want to do journalism anywhere besides it within that white enclave. As I was driving from the airport today and turned on your NPR station, everyone was talking about, depending on how you would interpret the behavior, the civil disobedience around the immigration demonstrations, the demonstrations themselves, the objectives of the demonstrations over immigration. This is the tip of the iceberg. And the conversation is, in fact, full of voids because it's such a repetitive conversation. As I drove along, I thought about where this conversation all began and how related it is to U.S. journalism. For example, a lot of the way we talk about Mexicans and in what I call the ricochet effect, Mexican Americans, is really rooted in the war with Mexico. In 1846, 47, 48, the U.S. thinks of that in a particular way, and the Mexicans think of it in another way. And so you should know from where I come to have this conversation with you tonight. I was born in this country and raised in Mexico, largely because my father did not want his children to experience racism. And so I grew up in a very different sort of atmosphere. First of all, it was okay to be Mexican in Mexico, and so I didn't go through what many of my students in Texas are still going through. I grew up in Mexico, and one of the things that I learned very early on was that history is subjective. See, I went to the school my father went to, which was the American school in Mexico City, and he went there because his father said English was the language of business, And if you could speak English well, you would always survive. But by the time I was in the 3rd grade, it became very clear that the kind of education I was getting made one of the realities we often don't notice until much later very evident. In Mexico, the educational code requires that if you are learning in a foreign language, like English or French or German or Japanese, all of those schools are present in Mexico, you must also learn the entire Mexican curriculum from Mexican textbooks taught by Mexican teachers in Spanish. So what you learn very early is that if you want a good grade on the history test, especially the test that deals with U.S.-Mexico relations, and you're taking the test in Spanish, you answer the questions a particular way. And if you want a good grade in English from information in American textbooks written in English, you answer the questions another way. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like in a minute. The way in which you learn that history is subjective is one of the best, one of the best lessons someone who turns out to be a journalist could ever have. Because often in this country, we think of journalism as sort of two-sided, kind of like a piece of toast, butter on one side, peanut butter on the other. 2 sides to every story, but no story has only 2 sides. Any journalist who approaches a story as a 2-sided exercise is missing most of the story. So let's go back to where journalism and Mexico first had their clash. The war with Mexico was the first time that Americans named foreign correspondents, American newspapers. And they were largely from the South. The most famous one was from the New Orleans Picayune. And they set off to write about who Mexicans were. And both of the countries were very young. And Americans largely defined themselves in terms of what they weren't. They weren't British, they didn't have kings. And then, during the war with Mexico, they weren't Mexicans and had a lot of negative things to say about Mexico. That war, like many, many other wars fought by the United States, was one of those wars where one side, the U.S., was overwhelmingly better armed, better equipped, more ferocious than the Mexican army, which was brand new. The country was only 20 years old. It had no budget because the Spanish had taken the treasury with them when they left. It had no central government, and so it was a really unfair fight. In fact, Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in that battle, wrote in his diary that it was probably the most unfair war ever waged by a much larger nation against a much smaller, vulnerable one. But the U.S. walked off with half of Mexico's property. And so when you turn on your TV tonight and you see people criticizing people waving Mexican flags in Los Angeles, you might remember that part of the message has to do with the history of U.S. behavior in the Western Hemisphere. We talk about the Monroe Doctrine, but south of the border we study the Monroe Doctrine as the way in which the United States justified for itself the right to invade Latin American countries at will. The United States has invaded those countries almost 200 times. It has supported authoritarian governments that brutalized their citizens. Just last week, we had the anniversary of the assassination of Salvador Allende. So when you turn on the TV and you see people waving those flags, some of that message is, hey, we're still here. You know, you've invaded our country, Mexico, multiple times, but we're still here, and we're still proud of who we are. One of the things that interests me about diversity is that part of what happens when we try to write these stories, particularly these stories of conflict, is that we aren't prepared to be diverse. Indeed, we haven't really integrated the newsroom much, right? Over the last 25 years, well, now it's 27 years, Since print news said that they would reach parity by the year 2000, print newsrooms have integrated by 0.5% per year. And in many years, they have lost more minorities than they have hired. And part of the problem is that they have integrated, but they have done nothing to build intellectual diversity. Right? We'll get a few of those people, different colors, a few of those people whose names we can't pronounce, and everything will be okay. But it isn't okay. So one of the things that one of the things that is wrong is that I argue is that we're approaching integration in all the wrong ways. We approach it from the physical side. We, just as I said, we take representatives of populations and stick them in newsrooms. Not too many, because, we really don't want them ganging up on the editor, telling him he's wrong. And usually it is he. And that's a genetic way of looking at what needs to be done. It's census-driven. Every year the newsrooms tell us how many of what kind are there. And what happens is that diversity then is vested in that person. That person is often asked by editors, so how do blacks feel about this? What are the Mexicans saying? As if one or two people could tell you. What's missing is the intellectual diversity, which requires an information base. So when I tell you, for example, that the U.S. war with Mexico was one of the most important influences on American journalism, you should know that not only did it lead to the first foreign correspondence, but for the first time, the news industry used state-of-the-art technology. And that meant that they used the Pony Express for parts of it, and they used the railroad for other parts, and they used the fledgling teletype in order to speed the story along. It was really expensive, kind of like having to buy computers and build in the internet, because that's what it was for its time. So 5 of them decided that 5 different newspapers that, they'd share the expenses, and thus was born the Associated Press. So the Mexican War gave us, in the industry, quite a few new ways of looking at the news, and some ways of looking at it we could do without. So what you have to do in order to keep a newsroom integrated is to have an intellectual foundation in which diversity is rooted, so that everyone is responsible for diversity. When you don't have that, you wind up having what I call cultural illiteracy. First time I ran into cultural illiteracy, and long before I could say all these fancy words, was when I came to the States as a teenager to visit a friend who had formerly lived in Mexico. And I was young. I was about to be 14. And this was a very nice family in Houston. And when I arrived, they put together a little party so I could meet my friends' friends. And in Texas style, the parents came too. And a woman came up to me and she said, "And what is your name, little girl?" And I said, "Mercedes Carolina de Uriarte." And she said, what kind of name is that?" And I said, "It's Mexican." And she said, "Oh, you couldn't be Mexican." Well, that was a surprise to me. My family went to Mexico in 1828, how more Mexican could you be? And I said, "Well, but I am." She said, "You must be Spanish." Well, what she meant was something that I really didn't understand, so I tried to explain to her. We're not Spanish in Mexico. We had this war, like you had a war, and now we're Mexican. And she said, "If you changed your name, you could pass." Now, to me, pass had to do with your grades. And I was really indignant. I told her that I was on the principal's honor roll. And then we looked at one another because we weren't talking about the same things. And it was my first real exercise in cultural illiteracy. I didn't know what she was talking about. She was talking about race. And years later, when at the LA Times we were redoing the style book and trying to decide what language we would use to describe people like me and others, we threw out the word Hispanic because of its racist roots. At the time, there were 3 of us in the editorial staff, myself and 2 guys, in an editorial staff of 821. So we didn't have what you'd call a lot of power. Excuse me. But we made 2 very good arguments that carried the day. One was that if you went south of the border and you saw a group of people standing there, and you said to them, ¿Quiénes son? Who are you? They would not say, Somos Hispanos. In fact, we have a few derogatory names for Spaniards, just like we do for gringos. And so, if that name is not used, why should another nation decide to redefine a whole population? The other is that it has a racist history. In this country, the lighter the skin color, higher up the class level you can aspire to move. And when Mexico lost the Southwest, which was their Northwest, to the United States, those people who were lighter-skinned Mexicans defined themselves as Hispanic in order not to be confused with the darker-skinned Mexicans who they referred to as peones, or peasants. And that's a heritage that's unfortunately still among Mexican Americans today. More and more now people call what is referred to as a Hispanic population Latino, because, consider my own experience. In the time I've lived in the United States, according to the U.S. Census, I've been Spanish surnamed for one census, Hispanic for another census, Mexican American for another one. There's something wrong with an identity that changes that much. But I can tell you when it changes. So you're in Mexico, right? And you're headed to the United States. And you're driving along, and you're Mexican. You get to the middle of the bridge, you become a Hispanic. It's amazing. And that happens because we do not have intellectual diversity. We have no idea what we're talking about. So, when people ask me to talk about diversity, I always begin by sitting around thinking, so exactly who am I? And how many of my identities are my own, earned by myself, or the result of my mother and my father having gotten together? And how many are some kind of political construct, depending on where it is the United States is right now? You look at all those people who are out in the streets of Los Angeles and Washington the last few days, and you know that the immigrants they're talking about are here because it's beneficial to the United States to have them here. This is a workforce that the United States historically has underpaid, has given no benefits to, has abused, has ignored the civil rights of. That's how we keep a profit margin. We have, in fact, one of the slides that I think is on this particular selection is a cover story I did for Progressive Magazine, which is now used in, I think now it's 12 different textbooks, college and graduate level, that talks about the cyclical abuse of immigration law in this way, where first we invite all these people in, we exploit them, and then we target them, and then we deport them, and then we look the other way while they come back so they can take the jobs that others will not do. Ronald Reagan did this in the 1980s in something called Operation Jobs. He claimed that these immigrants were taking jobs from Americans. So he deported them. He came sweeping in to all the places where immigrants worked, deported hundreds and hundreds, And the businesses almost collapsed. Nobody rushed in to take those jobs. And in a few weeks, everybody was back again, and we all pretended that wasn't seen. So, I am actually a single mother. I was a single mother, sole support. But really, mostly now these days, especially in the days of affirmative action, I'm what you call a twofer, right? Hire one, you get 2 little marks on your integration report. One for woman, one for minority. So you have to be careful with identities. They are a changing thing and very politically driven. And one of the ways in which you know things are not only politically driven, but commercially driven, is to look at the use made of maps. No, sorry. This is a map that the Los Angeles Times has used all through the 80s, part of the 90s, for their display advertisers. Display advertisers are the people who pay the most money for the very large ads that are, come buy shoes here, and here's, a selection of 15, etc. The Los Angeles Times invented zoning. Zoning is when you use your newspaper in different ways in different neighborhoods in order to generate as much consumer interest as you can. And they color code their maps because they collect the demographics for all of these areas. Except one. You see that white spot in the middle? Who do you think lives there? Minorities. This is a map that helped win a lawsuit for some Chicano professors who sued the Times for libel. And one of their arguments was that the Times practiced institutionalized racism. This is a map of structured absence. This is a map that denies the existence of certain core members of Los Angeles society. And so this is a group of people that they collected no information about. And it's not a surprise. Some years earlier, Otis Chandler, who was then the editor and publisher of the Los Angeles Times, was asked by David Frost on national television why the Times didn't cover these communities. And he said, and you can find this actually quoted in several books, most recently in Racism, Sexism, and the Media by Felix Gutierrez, Clint Wilson, and Annette Chow. And Chandler said, well, our newspaper is too complex for them to understand, and they don't buy anything. That same year, I wrote the first news story about the growing and soon-to-be very large Latino community, Latino consumer community, the Latino market, 1978. Those 3 of us, and joined by some blacks and one Asian, demanded a meeting with Otis Chandler to explain to him that not only could many of us read that newspaper, but some of us actually wrote it and edited it. But what Chandler was guilty of was myopia, looking at the world through assumptions that are reinforced by a particular cultural lens. It's like when you read something in the paper, right? You're reading it and you say, wow, this is a really objective news story. All you've really said is, wow, this guy thinks just like I do. And unless you're reading from different directions, you aren't educated. You're just socialized. You're just seeing what you're expected to see. Just another Babbitt. This is another Times map. This was an exciting map. For 2 weeks, the Times was picketed by blacks. This is stigmatization by zip code. What did I do with that word? I apologize. I had pneumonia last week, and every so often my voice gives out. But look at this. How can you possibly This is part of that that white blank circle. So they had a news story that talked about how the blacks use the highways. You know, like that old poem, "The highwayman comes riding, riding." Well, that's what they were doing. The blacks come riding, riding, and they go to the white communities. And they had another map that showed the targets. This is the kind of behavior that the Kerner Commission said when they looked at how the press behaved during the riots of 1967, created and reinforced schisms between the black community and the white community. This isn't journalism. This is the New York Times version. So that was in the late 80s. This is the New York Times in the mid-90s. Criminal communities. And all of it leads to another kind of myopia. When we look at news stories that deal with drugs, generally what we're looking at is a bunch of people breaking into a home or a site where minorities have gathered and doing a drug bust. But if you're reading the paper regularly, you know that you are seeing a very biased presentation of drug use. In fact, just last week, the Boston Globe, looking at drug use in their own city, talked about the fact that of the 145 related drug deaths in 2003, the latest figures they have, 94 of the victims were white. 32 were black, 19 were, they say, Hispanic, I will say Latino. And this just backs up what the DEA has been telling us for at least a decade. The majority of drug use is white drug use. The majority of incarcerations are minority incarcerations. So you can understand why minorities don't think much of the way in which their communities are represented by the media. Excuse me. When I went to school, I learned about some of the different events in that war I was talking to you about. Growing up, I learned about this story, right? This is, in the background is what we call the Castle of Chapultepec. And in 1847, when American troops stormed that hill, greatly outnumbering 4-1 the people in that structure, it was a military academy. And the young men in it ranged from age 13 to the oldest was 20. And they had staff that were military to teach them and to train them in various ways. And the Americans charged up the hill, and when the Mexican commander ordered everyone to fall back, 6 cadets didn't do that. And the last one left alive wrapped himself in a Mexican flag and jumped off the cliff to his death. So at the bottom of that hill, we have those columns. You can see them. You can see them there in the foreground of Mexico City's main highway or main boulevard. Those are called the Niños Héroes, and we celebrate that event or memorialize it on September 12th and 13th. But in the United States, it's memorialized this way. This is the Marine dress uniform, and that red stripe down that pant leg celebrates the victory over those boys in Chapultepec Hill. The second time I think I met the most egregious form of cultural illiteracy has to do with that uniform. In the I guess it was the late 1970s, While I was at the Times, then Governor Ronald Reagan invited President de la Madrid from Mexico to come and talk about border commerce. You know, they're having the same problems you see on TV tonight. And it was a big deal event. A lot of people were invited, and those of us who had press passes went to see what was going on. So picture this. It was in a big hall. Everything was decorated very beautifully. And Ronald Reagan came in with his entourage, followed by the Mexican president. And as the Mexican president stepped across the threshold, the Marine Corps band, in that dress uniform, struck up the Marine battle hymn. What's the first line of that battle hymn? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battles on the land and on the sea. What a way to greet a guest, yes? And largely that kind of thing happens because we don't spend a lot of time developing intellectual diversity. We really just don't know anything much about anybody else. We read from one perspective. We read the mainstream press. We don't read the alternative press. We don't read the ethnic press. We have no idea what people are thinking by and large. At the end of that evening, a large white sheet cake was rolled out. Very large, big crowd. White icing. In the center of each individual square piece was a great big green icing dollar sign. This is what people think of dollar diplomacy south of the border. In this country, we refer to it as foreign aid. Well, foreign aid comes with strings. High interest rate, buy only U.S. products. Not so sure that's aid, but that's how it's perceived elsewhere. Can you imagine celebrating dessert that way? The other thing, of course, is representation. Who are we, and how do we represent ourselves? Now, I don't know how many of you were familiar with the readers there for elementary students of some years ago, Dick and Jane. But Dick and Jane were sort of the first look at the Brady Bunch, followed by Barbie. And because Dick and Jane lived in Pleasant Town, USA, and the readers were all white, they were criticized in the 1960s. And so they integrated. And if you read the text, it's all about how alike everybody is. See? It's just a different skin color, but they all do the same things, they all play the same games. Well, I'm not sure that's diversity. And then, of course, there's this, right? Now, beauty, like crime and sanity, is culture-bound. Every society defines it differently. So here's how we're going to integrate. We're all going to look alike. Started a long time ago. One of the effects of hegemony is that we so saturate the world with our ideas and our images that people begin to think that maybe they ought to look more like us. This is a gadget that was sold in the late 1800s in Mexico to make sure you didn't have an Indian nose and you looked more European. And of course, part of all of this has to do with myopia and the way in which we refuse to see ourselves the way we are. In fact, if I were to tell you, for example, as I tell my students, okay, today's exercise is the following. Let's define gang behavior, right? Let's make a list, right? Loyalty to the group, initiation, violence. Now let's define fraternities. Loyalty to the group, violence, crime. What's the difference? Why is one group a gang and the other a fraternity? It's that kind of myopia where we give different names and then we don't look to see what they mask. And this is one of my favorites. In 1992, in Los Angeles, there were major race riots. They were over what the black community saw as a real abuse of the justice system, when white cops were exonerated in spite of the fact that they had been televised beating a black man and injuring him so seriously he really never recovered. 3 weeks later, the New York Times had this front page story. As ethnic wars multiply, the U.S. strives for a policy. Poor old U.S., it's always stuck saving the rest of the world, modeling for. So this is all about strife, and of course it's followed by maps. We really love maps. And all those little black dots are in the places where there's racial strife. Look at the United States 3 weeks after 1992 riots. I defy you to find a black button on that map. So part of the challenge of integrating newsrooms and becoming diverse is that we have to begin to look at ourselves in the way in which we are and the way in which we behave. It hurts to acknowledge that, for example, and this goes back even further, but let's just go back as far as World War II. Since World War II, the United States has never invaded a country that was evenly matched and not a nation of color. We really like to beat up third world nations. Right? Look at Panama. We're all talking about Colin Powell as, the one voice of sanity. When issues in Iraq came up, we've forgotten about My Lai and his role there, and we've forgotten about Panama, which he orchestrated. Remember Panama? U.S. invaded Panama Christmas week. How many civilians do you think we killed? What did we go down there for? We went down supposedly to arrest this former CIA informant that we had used for years, Colonel Noriega. Kind of like we supported the Taliban until we decided we weren't going to support the Taliban. We actually sent them money even several months before we invaded over there. But we went down to Panama to do a little neat arrest. It was going to be one of those surgical strikes, I think was the word that was being used then. And before we left, we had dug graves for at least 3,500 unarmed civilians and pushed their bodies in and covered them up. And, of course, eventually we would get found guilty of war crimes, but we don't cover those news stories much either. But Colin Powell brought us that, and we don't talk about those things because we miss in news one of the most important of its standards in ethics, and that is contextualization. And you cannot have context without history. So, the next time you look at a news story, the first thing you want to ask is, so who benefits? Why are all these immigrants here? The Boston Globe and the Washington Post last week wrote news stories saying that the Latino community in the United States, the entrepreneurs had established businesses so successfully here that Latino businesses had increased by 31% in this country, the highest increase among any population group. So we're busy looking at, are they coming across the border? Should they be coming across the border? But we aren't doing much with the success and the contribution. And only every so often do you hear that all these people that everybody's calling illegal, a really offensive word, pay taxes, which they can never collect on, can never benefit by. And those that were guaranteed during the Bracero program that they would be able to draw the amount they put into U.S. Social Security are still suing to get that money they were guaranteed. So, there's always more than two sides to a story. One of the things that I have to tell you is that generally these aren't popular ways to think about things. And so if what you want is to be popular, you probably shouldn't be a journalist unless you want to do infotainment and fluffy stuff. The way in which we integrate news stories, news content, is we do food, fiestas, nice safe stuff. Of course, we often don't know much about them. I don't know whether in this area you're familiar with Cinco de Mayo, but I'd like to end on this note. In the Southwest, it's a big deal, and I know in the college where my son teaches, a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, they're even celebrating it there. Cinco de Mayo. It's our way of showing that, we don't mind these people having parties. And for the last 10 years, I've been collecting news stories about Cinco de Mayo. It's defined as Mexican Independence Day, which it is not. It's defined as a major turning point in the history of Mexico, which it is not. Indeed, we do not even celebrate it in Mexico. Cinco de Mayo was born this way. During the Civil Rights era, a group of graduate students at the University of California at Berkeley were trying to figure a way to show the rest of the population the richness and beauty of Mexican culture. And they knew they'd have to start at the schools, right? We get the PTA involved, we get the mothers involved. So first they wanted to start by celebrating Mexican Independence Day, which is September 16th. But the teacher said, we can't do that because the kids are barely there, we haven't had time to organize, we really don't know the parents yet. So they went back to their dorm and they brainstormed some more. And somebody said, a Texan actually, what about Cinco de Mayo? And so everybody decided, great, we'll have Cinco de Mayo. I mean, the Mexicans beat the French. Well, yes. But unfortunately, if you are Mexican American and educated in this country, you really don't know a whole lot about your history in Mexico. They did beat the French in a battle that was the only battle that the Mexicans won during this war with the French, and the outcome of which was reversed 36 hours later in a war that Mexico lost that led to the invasion and conquest by France for the next 4.5 years until the United States finished with its civil war and told the French that that was their right. Manifest destiny, only the U.S. can invade Mexico, so the French went home. Cinco de Mayo as an event didn't go anywhere for some time. And then it happened that the Mexican-American boycott of Coors beer over labor issues really gained ground, and Coors began to lose money. So Coors went to the 3 largest Mexican-American organizations, and they said, hey, we'll give you $350,000 to promote fiestas if you stop supporting the boycott. And thus, Cinco de Mayo was born, and the boycott was abandoned. And you can find all of this in a number of places, but probably the best place is in a book called Anything But Mexican by Rudy Acuña. And speaking of Rudy Acuña, who is one of the best-known Mexican-American historians in this country, if you want to know the history of Mexican-Americans in this country, you might start by reading Occupied America, which talks about the life of Mexican-Americans in this country, the way in which this country did not honor its treaty at the end of the war with Mexico. Indeed, there has never been a treaty that the United States has signed with Mexico that benefited Mexico much, including NAFTA, which is part of why you have Mexicans coming here for jobs, since NAFTA has limited even more the jobs they had there. So, I guess my final remarks are that if people talk to you about diversity, ask them to clarify. Are they talking about integration, or are they talking about intellectual richness and expansion? Thank you. Let me end on what I think is a good note to remember. This is from a collection of cartoons called Academe, and I just love this one. You see the dean and the faculty member are talking. And the dean says, the graduate students thought it multiculturally significant that you added cilantro to the onion dip. Cilantro is a Mexican parsley. Well, that's about how we do it.
Do you have any questions for
the contrast that you made between integration and diversity seems to make sense. Integration would be, you said, genetic-based and census-driven and focused on the individual, whereas diversity would be more intellectual, based on the information-based. But wouldn't we say that to achieve diversity in the workplace and institutional settings, that integration is important? And that means that diversity has to be created one individual at a time, bringing in individuals who would bring in the perspectives of the underrepresented groups. So is there some way
You have to bring in the individuals, of course, but the problem is, as the figures show, they don't stay if they have an environment that is not intellectually diverse. So the reason that the predominant reason that newsrooms have only been able to integrate at the rate of 1.5% per year, the averaged over 25 years, is that it's a hostile environment. And if you interview journalists, both those who leave and those who struggle to stay, they will tell you that the burden is on them and that their suggestions for news stories are dismissed as too political, too biased. Remember, it was whites who defined objectivity, and so there's always that. And unless everyone is intellectually diverse enough to recognize that there are other ways of looking at things, it gets exhausting. But you're right. Yes, of course, I'm not suggesting that one replace the other. And if you want to find that study that was mentioned earlier, you can just put diversity disconnects into Google, and you'll see that argument is, of course, that we must have both. Thank you for raising the question and clarifying. You know, one of my favorite stories of myopia has to do with when my daughter and I were at Yale. See, I did everything wrong. I was a teenage mother. I didn't start college until my son was in the 3rd grade. By then I was in my mid-20s, and I thought I was too old to go to college until a friend I kept saying, you know how old I'll be in 4 years? Until my friend said, so how old will you be in 4 years if you don't go to college? Which was a very good point. But by the time I got to Yale, my daughter was out of high school, and we had a deal that, because they both graduated very young, that the first year after college, after high school, they'd kind of explore different things, and I'd support them, and then they'd go to college. So my daughter entered the first integrated, that is to say, gender integrated, males and females, class at Yale that was allowed to begin for the full 4-year experience as freshmen. So she was living in the dorm, and as required. I was living down the street with a dog, a cat, her brother, and 2 snakes. And when she was carrying around her furniture, she did something to her back, and they sent her to the infirmary. And the doctor came in to talk to her, and he said to her, well, you know, it's psychosomatic. Girls have such a hard time leaving home. And she kept saying to him, my home came with me. You know, it's just 4 blocks away. But he couldn't hear that, because what he saw was that, women were kind of fragile, and Yale was a competitive guy place. And this is clearly her problem. That's the trouble with myopia, and the trouble with, these circles of certainty that we look at the world through. They're so comfortable. Other questions? No. Okay.
And of course, the president of Harvard, Larry Summers, has said that largely because he said that females are not as intellectually critical in mathematics and science. Of course, he's in the middle of his ongoing controversy. But let conservative programs on the radio, a newscaster who was bemoaning the institutionalization of liberalism in American universities, and one of his the targets of his criticism was multiculturalism. I think that he would agree with you that all history is subjective, but he would use it against your argument. He would say that perhaps you're presenting subjective interpretation of history by focusing on certain facts and overlooking the mainstream of American history and culture. And so what would you say to that? Is multiculturalism and diversity, do they represent just another subjective interpretation of history?
But history's full of subjective interpretations. I mean, that's why you need to read broadly. That's why we have an alternative press and an ethnic press, because historically things get left out. My first job at the Times was to be the editor of the opinion section. There were the assistant editor. And one of the things I learned really very quickly was that unless I read the alternative press, I had no idea what it was I needed to fill our pages with as quickly as possible. The alternative press historically leads the mainstream press in revealing news by 6 months to a year. And in the case of cocaine and the CIA in Central America, by 10 years. And when I was, that was my beat. My intellectual beat was Latin America. And one of the publications that was most helpful to me was Soldiers of Fortune, which is a magazine for mercenaries, because that's what we were using in Central America. And that's all that subjective reading. None of us is objective. Every one of us sees the world through the lens of our own experience. There's no way you can see it through the lens of someone else's experience unless you go find things written from some other perspective. And like I said, there's nothing more obedient than a socialized population. Oh, we'll read the mainstream press. They'll tell us what all the big guys in power are saying. We'll believe that. We'll be so obedient. And, just look around. Tell me what obedience has gotten us. So, yes, I would agree with that. It's all subjective. And we need every bit of it, or we aren't thinking.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.